Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. Hello on the stream and hello live here at Bergen Kunsthall. Welcome to an afternoon, 1 hour approximately, with talks that take place as part of the exhibition and the exhibition opening day, The Ocean. The exhibition has several parts. We're not opening all the parts today, we're opening offsite projects, and the gallery remains still closed for a couple of days. But we wanted to use this opportunity of having artists in town and to have a couple of conversations here with some of the participants in the exhibition. The ocean has a complex or large topic. It's a reference point to which a lot of questions about our relation to history and the future unfold. And so we have 2 panels today. To the first one, I'm very happy to invite, welcome with me on the stage, Sheila Feruzi Kasim, as one of the members of the group VUMA, who produced a new work for the exhibition that is actually already out there and available. We'll talk about it in a moment. And the second, Bea Schlingelhoff, also a work that is already out there and possible to see. It's planted, so to speak. And maybe we start with a couple of images by the two of you. I ask questions and then have a moment of conversation. I have a very specific angle or interest in talking to both of you at the same time. But maybe we start with the images from Bea. Bea is a German artist based in Switzerland and working not necessarily with ocean as a topic typically in her practice, but working with a critical approach to history, and especially using invitations to exhibitions as opportunities to look into the history connected to exhibition sites. And when I started talking to Bea about the exhibition, The Ocean, the first point that you revealed was that you actually even moved to a lake to be close to water because it's a topic that's close to your heart. Maybe we can speak about it also in a moment, but I wanted to start with images. And the first set of images that we put out is from a show that you had a couple of years ago here in Norway at an exhibition space called Schloss in Oslo. What was this exhibition about? What do we see here?
Hello, everyone. So this is an exhibition where I designed 5 different typefaces, and all these typefaces were dedicated to a woman that fought in resistance to Hitler. And so here you see one of the names. So it was Marianne Baum, Ella Trebe, Hannah Solf. It was altogether 5 of them. And the typefaces were not necessarily a portrait of the women, but rather I was interested in the distribution of these names.
Of the show?
The title of the show was Women Against Hitler.
Oh yeah, very direct, yeah.
Yeah.
How come with designing typefaces, is that, do you have an education in design, or what's your approach to typefaces?
No, I learned it for the exhibition. One program, I asked, a proper typography to show me how to use a program, and he did show me that. But for typographers, I think there's a lot of errors in these, typefaces that you can download. The kerning is off, for example. Kerning is very bad, so usually graphic designers that get the typefaces are not so happy.
Exactly, and you mentioned the idea of distribution because often in recent shows you made type fonts available for download during the exhibition period as part of the exhibition.
Yeah.
Then maybe a second project which appeared already in the Schloss show.
Yeah.
Could you explain a bit about this work? It's something that's typically for conceptual art, not really. It needs a bit of explanation when seeing a picture.
Yeah. So maybe if you go back one picture, there you see it already. This was a former. It was meant to be a press release originally, but then it didn't get accepted as the press release, and so I made it kind of a discussion or agreement whenever I do an exhibition at an institution or an exhibition space. And it was called Women Festo. I changed the name now because it insinuated a little bit too much that it's a manifest or a manifesto or a contract. It's not really a contract, but it shows several points where I kind of try to discuss the history of feminism or the absence of the history of feminism in art institutions. And usually what happens is I sit down with whoever invites me and we go through these points, and then the director or the curator or the artist who runs the space are invited to make changes. And then if we go to the next picture again, here you see it as well. So the changes are handwritten into the document, and it's usually exhibited with these changes that either the curator, director, or artist makes to the document. And then it gets displayed. But it's not a contract, and it's not really conditional. So sometimes directors, curators, or artists do not sign it at all, for example. There have been several occasions where people just did not feel comfortable signing it or just didn't want to sign it.
Then maybe just one point about the typefaces again. Because what I found interesting in this project is that they can be seen in some way as related to discussions around monuments, or like how to memorize, how to create memorials for people. And these typefaces are in a way a very immaterial way of creating a monument. And now coming to the work that you have made for our exhibition here, The Ocean, this is actually a proper monument, you could say. It's the most traditional way of making a monument. It's a bronze sculpture. Do you want to explain the what it is for?
Yeah.
We don't have an image yet. Because
so, yes, it's something I actually never have done before in a lot of terms. It's a very representational, illustrative almost, and it's a woman holding a baby that is still connected to the umbilical cord. I'm not sure if I'm saying this right, umbilical cord. It's an illustration of a theory that Elaine Morgan in the 70s published in a book that is called The Descent of Women, which is a commentary really on Darwin's book, The Descent of Man. And she's a Welsh anthropologist, and she's explaining the reason why humans walk erect as a result of women giving birth in the ocean, in the water. And then, after giving birth, having to raise the child above water so it can breathe. So her proposal really is that evolution, or the erect walk, is a result of women giving birth in the water, and not because of hunting or men going out there and having to, you know, provide hunting food and providing food. Yeah. So I think she's proposing she's appropriating. You have heard this maybe all. This idea of the aquatic ape theory, and is pushing it a little bit more towards a feminist perspective, even. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so this monument is really an illustration of this idea, and this is why it's placed in salt water in the ocean as a representation of the theory. I'm hoping it works as a representation of this idea and not as a representation of a woman giving birth. That's a bit the tricky thing, that it probably could just be read as a pieta or.
Good, thanks. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot that can be further explored. Like Elaine Morgan was actually, before we talked about it, I did not know her and her writing or her as a person, but of course there's a lot of connections to other writers' work, like Ursula Le Guin, for example, with the carrier bag theory of fiction, where she also proposes a kind of shifted approach to evolutionary theory and seeing a lot of the kind of gender bias in this kind of research work. So, and interestingly, in Elaine Morgan's case, very much connected to the ocean, which is also there's a lot of feminist thinking in the past years, one could say, exploring water and the ocean as a field of knowledge that has been for centuries excluded from a male canon of thinking. But I wanted to switch to Sheila and VUMA. Also a project that, in a way, thinks about distribution and one could say, and that is the project that is presented also as part of the exhibition, VUMA Sona. VUMA is a group, but presented here as part of an art exhibition as an artist group. But the core is actually also something that has to do with media and distribution of information, journalism in the widest sense of the word. So there's this kind of maybe overlap. So do you want to talk a bit about your approach in general, but also to the project in the exhibition?
All right, yeah.
And also switch.
Yes, thank you. So, VUMA is basically a Bergen-based initiative which works towards highlighting minority voices in terms of media, arts, and also journalism. So we first started wanting to start a magazine, but then once we created a group where we were going to different cultural events and having discussions, and it kind of evolved and morphed into different projects that we've been doing over the past 2 years. And so I think in 2020, before the lockdown, we were commissioned for an art project with Bergen Center for Electronic Arts, which was the first kind of bit of an app called VUMA Sona, which is the geo-triggered audio app, which highlights kind of history and people's relationship to different parts of the city. So and so now for Bergen Kunsthall, under this umbrella of the oceans, we're kind of exploring, Bergen's history in terms of migration and immigration to the city, and having kind of discussions and discourses about how the city's been influenced through travel through the oceans.
Which is like a super important aspect of the ocean, that, it's an infrastructure for transport, for travel. And maybe talking a bit more about the project, it's an app that guides to 3 locations in the city. Do you want to talk about them, or is it?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
So basically, once you download the app, you can go around, explore these different stories. And so the whole project consisted of, I would say, 3 phases, of one with researching and then writing the script and then recording. And so we've created sort of like different walks where you can explore and listen to the story on site. You have to actually go to those places to access the stories. When we were researching the stories, we kind of focused on kind of the intersection between Bergen's history and in connection to colonial history. Our researchers, Adam and Noura, and also Krista, who's part of the team, she's sitting over there in red. We found 3 stories that we wanted to explore more. And so just talking about the images, the first image you were showing, I kind of forgot to mention, once we found the stories we wanted to talk about, we recorded a kind of samples of them, and we created this kind of makeshift studio tent and went around asking people for their feedback. And so one of the most important parts of the walks or the stories is people's reflections. And so you get to hear kind of the locals interact with the stories and their opinions, which, I would say, like in Norway, most people who are active in debates concerning history and such are people who speak the language. And so if you kind of fall outside of that, your opinions and your point of views kind of disappear from the public discussion. And so this was our attempt at gathering that. Yeah. And so also once you walk, you'll be able to listen to people kind of comment, and in different languages. It's not just Norwegian and English. Yes. So towards the end, the tent got a little makeover. So we were really lucky to be able to do this outside. I kind of wish that we had more time to kind of be outside and talk to people and gather even more reactions on that. But that's definitely like one of the challenges we met during gathering reflections, is that women tend to be, it's sadly like a bit timid. It was very hard to, they were willing to listen, but not to give a reflection or a comment along the process. So yeah.
And the people who were kind of invited to listen and give feedback were passerbys, and you also invited, I think you also spread the word through your own networks for people to join.
Yes.
To encourage coming.
Yeah. It was very, very interesting, as in seeing the project through other people's eyes, especially passerbys, because I remember when we first started with the tent, it didn't have none of this graffiti going on. And so one day we asked an artist we know to just come by and spray paint it, whatever she wanted. And then there was one lady who was sitting at a cafe, like on the other side of the street, and she was like, I thought you were homeless or something. Like, what is this tent? And then she came all the way to ask, and that's very rare, I would say, because people in Bergen are very shy, but it could be the weather. Then suddenly everyone is like, curious and willing to walk up to you. And so she listened to the story, and she was, I would say, in her 70s and a local from here, and she was like, I've never heard of this story before. And so it was kind of interesting meeting people who, pass by a place and don't know the history behind it. Yeah.
Which story was that?
So the 3 stories we have one towards Bryggen, and it's about a stowaway passenger named August. And he came from St. Thomas to Bergen in the late 1800s. And so that's like the first story. And then this story is about a Norwegian expedition called the Deborah Expedition, which is a group of Norwegians who were dreaming of a better future, and they heard about a rumor about this island on the coast of Madagascar called Aldabra, and so they sold they packed up everything they had in order to go on this expedition in hope of finding something better. And so that's the story she was listening to on that spot. Yeah.
So maybe there's actually one more image.
Yes, and that's the last story, which is in Møhlenpris. And this is the Nygårdsparken. And so that's the story, kind of like the Danish-Norwegian slave trade and how it got kick-started.
And that's, I mean, the discussion on Møhlenpris is interesting because it has been, like last year, also in the wake of international BLM discussions, been really widely brought up.
Yeah.
So it is something that is kind of active in the thinking of people living in Bergen, I guess.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, when we were gathering comments, most people were saying, yeah, we've heard about this particular discussion because it was all over the media last year. And so when it comes to like reflections, as I was saying just now, that we were most interested in getting the perspective of people who live there, who pass by and interact consistently with the space. And even though there was a discussion about it, most people still did not know of certain details concerning Tumøren. Yeah. So.
Yeah. So why I thought it would be nice to talk to both of you on the same panel was also because when preparing the show, I thought a lot about institutional critique, as I mentioned, which is maybe was, I don't know, to me myself maybe surprising to find myself reconnected to such a term, but I guess it's maybe I'm not. I don't think I'm the only one who reconsiders this approach within the arts. Like historically, there were several waves of going back to the historical institutional critique, and I guess in this case, it's also maybe the notion of what do we deal with as an institution has changed. While the historical institutional critique was very much about the institution where artists were exhibiting and the power structures inherent in institutions, now this is also understood in a much broader sense as institutions being entangled with power structures, with regimes that discuss, for example, about who's considered to be main audience, for example, or the majority of a society. And so, and it has a lot to do with finding a language to actually address critical points of views. And I thought with both of your projects, what's so interesting is that they both work in a way with immateriality or with various forms of contemporary media, like fonts that are downloadable and that kind of capture this kind of a trace of memory or a kind of something that's possible to distribute, to memorialize resistance movements. And with VUMA's project in a similar way, it's this app that kind of infiltrates or intervenes in public space in this immaterial form. This time you actually also made a material aspect, but this immaterial approach I thought was really super interesting because it maybe deals with in another way. It kind of intervenes also in fields of knowledge. It's like we use the phone in a certain way to gather information, and hence also this critical information comes in. How would you say, how do you in your work think about something like critique or positioning yourself towards majority knowledge, maybe? Maybe do you have
Yeah, I would say, I think first of all was our decision to kind of go with an app is that it's accessible to everyone, and it's like you can be, most people inhabit a public space, and so you're not, if you're not able-bodied, your barrier is not, oh, I cannot go up the stairs of this place. It's outside, and so the outside is kind of a place for everyone in a way. And so, and another thought we had is that for us, this project is kind of a permanent thing. And the hope is that with time, we'll be able to collect different things and maybe revisit it in maybe 10 years, 5 years, as long as apps are relevant then, I don't know. But in terms of like institution critique and kind of majority and culture, or being kind of in the subculture of things, is that, for example, in the African tradition, history is passed down orally. Rather than written. Well, in the European context, churches are very important. That's where you find, when people were married, birth dates, and all of these things. While for other people, it's kind of, your name or the history that you've learned through your grandparents and such. And so the idea we were thinking was like, okay, so how do we preserve kind of the history and the presence of minority people living in Norway in the modern context? And so. Telling stories in this way kind of felt like it connects in so many ways in terms of kind of different cultural traditions, but also that it exists and it's accessible right on your phone. And the power with doing that is that you're not dependent on a space. You're not dependent on an institutionalized building in order to publish, and kind of that's the beauty of the internet, that it's kind of so accessible for most people. Yeah.
Do you have an answer?
The same question?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I have had a very changing relationship to that term, institutional critique. There was times where I thought, oh, it should only be used very historical and only specifically including the artists we know from that time, like, I don't know, Mary Kelly, Martha Rosler, Shapiro, Juliet Chicago. And so keep it very specific as a description and as a specific time. But then I changed, and then I thought, actually, it is a quite useful term to use, institution. Again, now maybe to think at what it means historically, what it means as a form of infrastructure, how we navigate within this infrastructure as artists, and what dependencies we also have. It's quite a dilemma to be critical towards the institution you work with. So at the minute the institution accepts your critique, it's already a little bit suspicious. Like, there's this always the potential of immediate co-option, or so to discuss or to navigate this, I do find helpful, and I do find the term, again, it might change again, but at the moment I do find the term institution quite useful again. I mean, it's maybe 20 years ago, one would have called it apparatus or governmentality, or the infrastructures of power we, as artists, profit and want to critique at the same time. No, it's an interesting contradiction to be in, or predicament, or Troy. Depends. Can be many of these things.
Yeah.
No? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But just to mention also a recent project. You in your work, you sometimes force institutions to actually either implement a change or acknowledge historical guilt.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Maybe do we have the possibility to have questions from the audience now? Is there a question? Because I think we would change soon to our second panel, but maybe it's if there are questions by someone. Here, sorry. Over there. Yeah. No, we have to have the microphone, yeah.
Thank you. So I just am very curious about both your works. And I was wondering, when the stories that VUMA are working with and will continue working with forever, I hope, can you tell us a bit how you chose the specific stories and how you researched it, and how it also changed your relation maybe to those spaces? And yeah, curious about that. And then I'm also curious in general about this idea of institutional critique. And I mean, how is it to be the institution and be critiqued? Axel, also, is it possible to, can we actually do something about, what can we change within a structure that's so locked? Is it possible, as someone who is in a, is head of something or is working, how much headspace how much can you change before you get kicked out by a board? And we have a lot of things going on in the country and in the north where some of us live also at the moment. How much space do you have to, before you get kicked out? So, yeah.
Okay, so I can just address in terms of research. I think really early on in the project, we were very sure about doing a public discussion on To Merlin's story, and simply because that it was in the media and it was kind of broadly discussed. But then we wanted to kind of go into the details of who this man was and his background and his history. And it was very fascinating to learn in terms of that story that he himself named the area. It wasn't like a prize he was given. He chose that name. He was like, okay, I'm just going to name this place after me, as you do. And then the other two stories were kind of, I'm born here, and I've kind of gone through high school and middle school and all of that here in Bergen, and so there were kind of some stories I've never heard before, kind of like, who was the first black man in Bergen, and how was his life like? And then also the story about the Deborah Expedition. Early on, we spoke to different Norwegian researchers and had meetings about like their work and such, and then we came across Deborah's story. And it was just a really fascinating story, because at the time where these people decided to go to South Africa and end up in Madagascar, a lot of Norwegians were migrating to the US. And they just like made a different plan, and we're like, no, we're gonna do our own thing. And so just telling that story and finding that there's so many connections with that story, with kind of the contemporary cases of migration and people seeking asylum, with that one, I feel like it's packed into it. And so that was kind of what went behind each decision to focus on those three narratives. Yeah.
And the second part of the question. Well, this is the topic. No, but I mean, of course, like the bottom line is, it's always much easier within an institution to speak about critical topics than, I guess, apply a critique to the institution itself. And that's, I mean, the board, or I guess, how an organization is structured is one thing, but it's not necessarily outside power that prevents institutions or organizations to actually do something and change towards a better state. It's more the kind of inherent slowness of institutionalness. And no, I mean, it's the past years have been really kind of a wake-up call, I guess, internationally, to that things have to change, and they made clear how much actually in institutions and organizations is still part of like that there are kind of dominant power structures reproduced in institutions that are often not really clear to people working there themselves. So this has been really an important process, I think, and also something that has accelerated a lot in the past years, and something that gets formalized and articulated and discussed, and I think this is super important. And I guess then to the question about board or government structures, also we are also all dependent on funding. This is then a point where institutions have to take that as an opportunity to actually also talk to their superiors or funders to actually bring a discussion more straightforwardly up and change things. And this is, of course, like it's about the whiteness of institutions, for example. It also has to do with how we use energy in institutions. It's about how we create access to the places we work with, and so on, yeah. But important topic and still a lot to do. Should we maybe change then to the next panel? So thank you both so much for the conversation and presentation.
Yes.
Thank you.
And,
Thank you.
now I'm happy to welcome Alma and Kåre, but first the microphones get disinfected. Excellent. That was fast. Thanks for coming with me on stage. And again, we first have a couple of images, and this time around we wanted to start with Alma Heikkilä, artist from Finland, based in Helsinki now.
Yes.
And active, besides being working as an artist, also with a collective called Mustarinda, with some roots even to Bergen.
Yes. Yeah, we have one member here in Bergen.
And yeah, you made an impressive work here down in the gallery, which very few have seen so far. It's a site-specific mural made from artificial materials,
Yes.
but representing processes or organisms which are usually described as natural. And so there's a kind of, an interesting discussion there already. But we brought also some images to actually show other works, or you sent me images, made a selection. And maybe you want to talk a bit about these first.
Well, these are a little bit that have something to do. There are something in common with the work that I made here. That I've like as one starting point, I had this idea, or I don't have the idea, but I looked into this kind of a view of life where none is kind of separate. So always live inside like some kind of structure that like you share it with other life forms, and you cannot be like in a vacuum or somehow step out from that kind of shared view of life, and kind of a symbiotic thing that you kind of we have been co-created through evolution with other species, but also very like super dependent constantly on other species. And it's also something that I find quite difficult to really realize myself also, even though I read a lot about these issues. It's like our culture is so individual in a way. And also museum as a space is very like, we show artists who are like made new work and are very like have their own title. So it's very like individual in many ways, and then thinking if life is not at all individual by its nature. So I was thinking of these different kind of bodies where life exists. So in this work there's it's like this exhibition that I made where I was thinking again of these different like kind of bodies for life. So in this one there's this one that I thought of, the air. So it's a like very invisible element that we also have in the museum, and we are constantly breathing it. I think now, because of the COVID, we know more that we are kind of sharing the air and kind of sharing all the bacteria and viruses and others there. But in many ways, it's still very invisible to see, but has a lot of content in it. And so I think in the next picture, if you change, yeah, this one is like one of my favorite things in the world is this kind of thinking of decaying tree trunks and like how they foster this enormous amount of life forms. And it's also something that's quite difficult to see because you can't kind of enter the tree trunks, and a lot of the life forms that I'm interested in are also very small in size, so you can't really see them with the bare eyes. But it's like this, as I live in Finland, like the forest is like the best environment in many ways, and this kind of decaying tree trunks are like the crown of the forest with their life forms happening. So it's this work has been around that a lot. And then we can go to there's still one that's a little bit about the soil life. Again, like something that is underground, like unreachable in many ways, but fosters a lot of extremely interesting things that also affect a lot of our daily lives in many ways. So often I've been kind of trying to make pictures of things that are somewhat impossible to have actually, or also through science we cannot have pictures of these things because you can't really, you can take like samples and take images of them, but then it's again like doing things like separately, like separating different species and thinking like more through that. So I've been more thinking of like what if everything is in this kind of together in a mass, like living and also dead, like things and minerals and this sort of stuff.
And the work here is more specifically also about, I guess, water as a habitat, or water as kind of,
Yeah, it intrigued me two different ways. One was that I already before been thinking of this, especially cyanobacteria that are like this first life forms to produce oxygen. So it's kind of been forming a lot how the planet is at the moment, and then also being like a very currently kind of a political thing, as cyanobacteria like green blue algae is kind of a big problem in many of the seas, and it's also a toxic thing. So it's often like this that I found it quite interesting that the same things that like foster you and keep you alive are also possibly toxic or somehow harmful, that they have like these different sides. And I also learned that there are some cyanobacteria naturally in all the room air, so it's like we are very much breathing cyanobacteria at the moment. So it's, I think for me it's interesting to think of the museum space also as that is very connected to the other life forms, even though it looks very plain and it's very made for humans in many ways.
But I understood it also like that there is this kind of distinction between land and sea, which is this traditional, I don't know, one of the many dichotomies that always are organized around one side, which is like land where we live, and the other side is the other, like the sea. And so I thought it was interesting that your work also works on a kind of they're questioning this separation very strongly, like by showing on a kind of microscopic level how these two areas are actually connected, not only economically, not only I don't know, culturally, historically, but there is also like on the kind of biological level actually a lot of interaction going on all the time.
Yeah, it's kind of, I think it's a bit like the same question that I've been thinking often is like the human body, like that. To me, it feels like I have very clear like borders in my body, but then when you look at it from different point of view, this kind of a border doesn't exist in that sense, that it's much more like things kind of going through your body and you're sharing it in different ways. I think it's a lot the same with the sea, and also how we carry our bodies and the liquids and this sort of also like historical traits.
Can I ask you one question about Mustarinda? Because, which is, I guess, more, has also this ecological focus, kind of, not sure if we would call it activist, but there is this level of self-organization and bottom-up work.
Yeah, it's an NGO, so it hasn't have like permanent funding, so it's very much like a group consisting of artists and researchers and other people active in other fields of life. And what kind of came to my mind now was I felt really sorry listening the previous talk. I remembered that I've been together with a few other people from Mustarinda making this list that I've been using a lot, that I sent before I have entered some exhibition, that where are like kind of a contract also, where you can, the place that's having the exhibition can choose a bit if they want to do some of the kind of suggested things that could a little bit like, because from my artistic point of view, it's often like so much of the artist's lifestyle and selections, and especially those like the most visible parts of the work that are seen like and calculated if they are like environmental or not. But then often the institutions carry most of the weight of the emissions in many of their activities, and so it's like something that I will maybe send you later on for future projects.
Thank you.
But in general of Mustarinda, it's been a lot thinking of this kind of ecological transitioning of the society, and thinking it also as a very shared task, like something that we just need to share and talk together, because there aren't any ready kind of ways how no one can tell us how to change, so we just have to try doing it and failing a bit, but somehow that it's also nicer to share that responsibility in many ways.
But Mustarinda you're based in Helsinki, but Mustarinda headquarters?
We also run a house that's it's in this very beautiful old growth forest in kind of a mid-Finland that from Helsinki is like almost 700 kilometers north. Yeah. And it's kind of this place that we thought that it helps a lot, like, because there we need to engage with all of the life activities, like everything we bring to the house we need to bring away, and like transport and food and heating. So we've been able to test all of these things and find new methods of how to arrange residency, for example. And so it is kind of, that sense, very nice. And also that gives this kind of, it's been running now for 10 years, so it gives this base to keep the discussion going in many ways, and also maybe have the forest as one particle of the discussion, since you are kind of surrounded and always somehow affected by the environment also. And actually it's not very easy in Finland to visit an old-growth forest, since it's so very effectively used by the forest industry, especially in the southern Finland.
Good, then thank you. And Kåre Grundvåg is part of is an artist based in Tromsø, and shows in our exhibition The Ocean together with Trond Ansten, who you used to have the artist group name Devil's Apron. Yeah. Which points to one concern in your work, which is algae or kelp, and your project here is also connected to that topic. But and actually the images that we selected are all connected to that topic. So maybe we start by with this image, which is maybe difficult to see, but. Yeah, do you want to?
Yeah, maybe I want to maybe take a bit of a background. So Devil's Apron has been a project we have been working on together for 5 years now. I think like the start of the project was it started with algae, and we basically didn't really know what we were doing, but it was born out of a kind of a frustration with sort of, in a way, technological transfer. Like we were in the north, we can't really grow corn to brew beer, but we were always importing this kind of technology from the south. And I was like, well, we should find something that we have around and like make a technology. And we came across some Inuits brewing with seaweed, and that became like a starting point for this project. And during the project, we came across several sort of old methods for brewing, and one of them was this intricately carved piece of wood called a kveikstock, where the brewers in the old times used to sort of store the yeast in these logs. And they were just so beautiful, and we just realized that it kind of pointed to a place where it was really difficult to say if like the agency was in the yeast or in the brewer. It was kind of this sort of symbiotic relationship between the brewer and the yeast. And that became like a really like important sort of perspective for us. Because so many of our sort of interactions are more sort of exploitative or parasitic or extractive, but like making suggestions that are more sort of mutual beneficial or like symbiotic. And so we came up with this, we called it the intertidal shelter part 1 and 2. And it was a work we did for LIAF in 2019. And it consisted of several logs that were placed in the water. And it was supposed to be like a kelp sort of garden, farm, or a way to sort of visualize the tidal zone and lifting it up, and that you could come close and we could talk about seaweeds and algae. And another part, which was also, it was called part 2, which was more of a performative action, and that's what we're actually seeing here. So it was a sort of a spa for the guests of the show. We used old sort of fishing boxes as spas when we heated hot rocks outside and carried in, and we did this collaboration with a seaweed factory, an experimental seaweed factory in Arkhangelsk that is in itself extremely interesting and has an incredible story, both like darkness and a lot of good things. So it was started after World War I, because the Russians were lacking iodine, yod in Norwegian, and they started this seaweed farm. Not farm, but they harvested wild seaweed. And it is on the Solovki Islands. So it also means that some of Russia's intellectuals, which were put there in the Gulag there, probably worked on this experimental seaweed factory. And that factory is still operating. And it's one of the few examples of sort of exploitative harvesting, where they have actually realized that they cannot continue working like this. So they started like trawling like industrially, but they just realized that they completely like destroyed the seaweed forests. So they actually went back to an old way of doing it, using like hand tools. And that's also like, I think like an important point for us, this sort of re-evaluation of sort of traditional methods or knowledge.
I think we spoke at some point about these efforts of big companies now to transition from seafood to seaweed, and the kind of disastrous effects that can have actually for the ground when it's kind of like harvested in large quantities.
Mm. Yeah. I think it's like, and this is quite important, you know, like a lot of sort of, especially like in Norway, that when you think about new technology, you're always thinking that we should scale it up to like this sort of massive scale immediately. But we just wanted to sort of try to take it down and say like there's some sort of qualitative values here, which is more like culturally and social, and that like people knowing the like ingredients and how to relate to it. It's not about, you know, like making the world's biggest seaweed farm, which is sort of greenwashing a super humongous big fish farm, and like try to derail it a bit. Like this is at least our proposal.
One of the first seaweed projects that I don't know you made maybe is actually this beer brewing experiment where I think it's also really about so basically one of the ways to ferment was to chew. Oh no, actually to break up the seaweed is to chew it, which means that every participant has to bring in themselves also on the kind of level of using your body in a very personal way.
Yeah. So we have been experimenting a lot with different sort of ways to sort of process it, and spit enzyme was one way we tried. I can say like hopefully it like in a good way. Actually, it didn't really work that well because it was a lot of work. But this way of trying to sort of refined knowledge, and just having that as sort of like a little core in the project, and going around Northern Norway talking with people, a lot of other very interesting things has come up. Like we also had the joy of interviewing a scientist from SINTEF and Statoil while we were doing this project with chewing the seaweed. And it was just this strange coincidence. We had a big lavvo full of drunk hippies at this hippie festival called Kalsjø, like a beautiful place. They all helped out with chewing the seaweed, and suddenly we had like a SINTEF Statoil scientist there, and he was like agreed to be like interviewed, and he talked about how we could sort of transition from sort of with all our sort of offshore knowledge in oil, blah, 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 and we could transition to sort of green, super huge seaweed farms with automated systems. And it was a great contrast. Yeah.
It was happening at the same time.
Yeah, exactly, at the same time. Yeah, we had like people with like tattoos in their faces spitting like seaweed in this common bucket, and this guy explaining the sort of automated systems. And but I think in a way what we're doing, like we're not scientists, so like our approach is way more like maybe related to like alchemy in a way.
And in the project that you made for Bergen Kunsthall, it's located on a bridge over there, also on the shore in the tidal zone. You used a new method. It's like it's not wood, but it's power-fueled alchemy in a way.
Yeah. Yeah, I can talk a bit about it. It's actually, I'm so grateful that we've been able to realize this, because it's a process I've sort of been trying and working with for over 10 years now. It's basically like an electrolysis process in seawater, where you can actually extract sort of minerals and salts and bind up CO2 and calcium and manganese from the seawater using like a low voltage electrolysis process. And the reason we do that is because we realized like that these wood sculptures we did in Liaf, it took a long time for sort of the marine organisms in tidal zone to actually sort of occupy it. So we just wanted to make like a better surface in a way. And this idea of sort of symbiotic, in a way, materials where you can sort of start it with electricity, and then you can like take down the electricity, and the sort of marine life will sort of continue this process that you kind of facilitated. It's like, I think like philosophically it's really interesting, because if you look at like more or less all the materials we make, they start to decay immediately when they're finished in a way. But trying to come up with sort of materials which can sort of continue and growing, and it's kind of made in a collaboration in a way.
And so you took this method from an utopian research working architect who,
so this work is heavily inspired by a German-American architect, Wolf Helmut Hilbritz, and he worked in the 70s. He had this amazing, like he also did like the science, like so he wrote a lot of very informative papers about this process of forming. He called it of various things, but one word that went through is like secrete, or like a concrete from sea. And he had proposals for whole cities, sort of self-sufficient societies built in this material. And we've been so lucky that we have actually, Axel has been able to actually bring one of his original works and also some of his drawings to Bergen Kunsthall.
We were
And he's it's like one of my heroes, so I'm so grateful to.
No, thanks for the suggestion and sharing the inspiration, because it was indeed super interesting, and it's also like it's one of the kind of it connects to utopian movements in the architecture, but sits on a slightly bit off location in relation to that, maybe. So that was also super interesting to see. Maybe, I mean, are there, because we have to wrap up soon, but are there questions from the audience that we should take?
Ellen.
Well, we have to wait for the microphone again. Sorry for the stream. It's not for us, it's for the people online.
Hello, Alma and Kåre. I know you both because we interact in each other's lives. But I was one question for each. Do we have time? Yeah. Kåre, it's the brewing thing.
Yeah.
I was reading a book about brewing lately, and I think it was actually because I went to some of your spa sessions and I got into the beer that was brewed with Finnmark's Porsche, because it has this psychedelic. And I'm very chicken when it comes to anything drug-wise, but that was a really special feeling in the body drinking that beer. So I got this book about brewing, and then it's also related to a lot of matrilinear research that I'm doing. So it turns out that everybody, as you know, did this brewing. So I was also thinking about when you're talking about, extractive industries, and, it's this thing that for instance, you can read all sources about use of seaweed in Sápmi in Norway and Fenno-Scandinavia, and it's part of the early tax reports that you were allowed to take this dulce from there, but you had to share it. So there is this knowledge at one point about plant use in all of Fenno-Scandinavia and Europe and most of the world that criminalizes particularly, women and also men, and particularly people of color and indigenous populations and queers using plants as daily medicine. And also the beer and the brew was holy, used in spiritual ceremonies also here in this land. So it's all this like knowledge, but then it's not gone, because people have kept it in various ways. So it's a lot of this power in and now they're popping up a million breweries everywhere. But there's this idea of, reviving tradition that has a spiritual side, but also kind of social aspect of always having brew for when someone is coming. So I just wanted to ask you a bit about this kind of, what did you find out when you were talking to people in the north about old brewing traditions? I'm so curious.
We found out a lot. It turned out that actually traveling around with a brewing project is like the perfect icebreaker. Like old grumpy men, kids, like everyone was interested. I remember especially like one interaction. It was on a pier at Onøya outside Træna. We were waiting for a boat. We were going from one island to the other. And we had a box with like seaweed and some clamps and stuff, and then he looked at us, and he probably thought, oh, some goddamn hippies or artists or something, and he was like, so what are you doing with all that seaweed? You're making some vegan salad or what? And we were brewing beer with it, and he was like, what? Tell me more. And he was like totally sold. One of the things interesting that you mentioned is the Finnmarks Porsche. which has been used quite a lot, and we learned quite a lot about it, and it's all these other kind of uses for it. Like a really important medicine plant, it was used for abortions. It was used to remove vermins from the house. You could cook basically anything with it. And all sorts of other sort of herbs, and also misunderstandings when it comes to like posh, Finnmarksposh, and yeah. And another point I would like to mention for you is like female brewing, and how sort of the witch processes was of course often related to female brewers, like the whole trope of the witch with the pointy hat. Like in Central Europe, it was actually like a sign that you were a brewer, because you were easy to see on the market, and you know, there I can go and get beer. So there's all these sort of layers popping up, and also how they kind of were shamed to stop brewing.
Yeah, I mean the criminalization of herbal use all around the world.
Yeah.
Because of course the Western patriarchal church traditions, through colonial history, spread sadly quite far and has almost penetrated, sorry to use that word, everything.
Yeah.
So, but then everybody, then there's this amazing resilience and resistance, and fighting back forever, and then people don't really know that these brewing traditions were until very recently, also used in childbirth in Eastern Europe, giving birth in saunas and using herbs and brews as part of that.
Yeah. I just want to say one more thing, and I think it's so important, like this, but because there's so much connected also to seaweed, which has been sort of shameful in a way. There's a lot of knowledge there, but it has always, like for so many years now, it has been considered, like famine food for the very poor. And I think it actually connects a bit to the sort of, church and monks wanting to sort of have monopoly on the brewing and herbal use, and sort of this sort of idea that they wanted to keep the knowledge and
control the distribution.
Yeah. Thanks for bringing that up.
Anyone else? Since otherwise we would just close the session off. And
I'm just, we can take it later also, but the difference between Finnmarksposh and Posh, I mean, I know Posh, but especially with the Finnmarksposh.
Do you want to say a little bit for the
Yeah. Okay, I'm just curious about the Posh, because I know it from...
Yeah. So there are two really different plants. Finnmarksposh is a rhododendron. So there it's maybe that sort of similarity in names comes from the similarity in use, like in brewing, for instance. But like botanically, they're like have nothing to do with each other.
Okay, I understand.
Yeah.
I like Posh.
And Finnmarksposh is also it's actually on the controlled substance list, because it's actually very active and can be really like poisonous. So one should be careful with it. We brewed quite a lot with it, but we chickened out, so we never like served it in that sense. But we had it around for special. Yeah.
okay, thank you so much for joining us today here, and you too, and everybody online. Yeah, thanks. At 5 o'clock we have a performance with, or by Arakawa, and with many volunteers and water from Fukushima, where A is initially from, at the Per Schlingelhoff monument called Bergen in Florida, Bergen. Please join us.